Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to another Ref Brandon and the Todd family YouTube video. Wherever you are, whatever you may be doing, thank you so much for making Ref Brandon and the Todd family a part of your day. We always greatly appreciate it. This week's Top 10 Countdown is going to be a fun one, so I would love to get some feedback from everybody and tell me what you think of this Top 10 Countdown. It is one that I have thought about doing for a while, but I've thought about doing it different ways, and I decided on doing it this way. And let me explain what I mean by that. This week's Top 10 Countdown is going to be the 10 biggest what-ifs in the history of professional sports. And I thought about doing top 10 what-ifs in baseball, top 10 what-ifs in basketball, and so on. And I decided to just do all professional sports and not narrow it down to just one sport. And the reason why I chose professional sports, it's not to say that I won't come back later on somewhere down the line and do a top 10 biggest what-ifs in collegiate sports. But the reason why I chose professional sports, even though I personally like collegiate sports better, the facts show, no matter how you want to slice it or dice it, that professional basketball is more popular than college basketball. Professional baseball is more popular than college baseball. The NFL is more popular than college football. So even though I personally might like collegiate sports better, overall, the numbers show professional sports are better. So that is what's most popular. And because of that, if you follow sports, you know that an athlete can be phenomenal in his or her sport, whatever sport they play. And they can put up great numbers at the collegiate level. But if they go to the pro level and they don't make it, they're always considered to be a bust or a flop, whatever word you want to choose. But by the same token, you can be mediocre at the college level and get drafted in the pro level at whatever sport you play. And if you go on to be great, people just completely forget about the fact that you were just decent as a college player. All that matters is at the pro level, you were great. So that's the reason why I'm doing top 10 biggest what-ifs in professional sports history. Just wanted to specify that. Like I said, it does not mean that I won't come back on here somewhere down the line at a later date, and we may do a video on top 10 biggest what-ifs in collegiate sports. But this week's top 10 countdown is going to be the 10 biggest what-ifs in professional sports. Now, you can get on just about any website, whether it's ESPN, Bleacher Report, 24/7, CBS Sports. You could go all day long on all these different websites and read about what-ifs, whether you want to read about baseball what-ifs, basketball what-ifs, football what-ifs, or just what-ifs in sports in general. So what I did was I sat back for the past week, ever since last Wednesday's top 10 countdown, and I have researched all the different what-ifs in all the different sports, whether it was things that happened before I was born or things that have happened since I've become a sports fan, and just sat down and thought about all of them and nailed it down to my personal top 10. So this is not a top 10 countdown from any certain person or any certain individual or any certain website from any certain sports website. This is my personal top 10, and I'm sure if you read all these different articles from all these different people on all these different websites, you would probably find the majority of these, if not all these, in most people's what-ifs, but this is my personal opinion. And like I said, any feedback, please feel free to let me know. Number 10 to me in the all-time top 10 what-ifs in sports history is what if Len Bias didn't overdose on cocaine. He played for Maryland at the collegiate basketball level, And by the time his senior year came around, he averaged 23 points and 7 rebounds a game. If you saw those stats nowadays, you would think that's just decent. But 35 years ago, you didn't score points in basketball the way you score points nowadays. Back in those days, a lot of teams were lucky if they scored 60. Now teams score 60 by the time it's halftime. So back 35 years ago, 23 points and 7 rebounds was great. And a lot of people thought that Len Bias was going to end up being one of the all-time great NBA players. But we'll never know because he was drafted by the Boston Celtics. And 2 days later, he overdosed on cocaine. So he may have ended up being one of the greatest NBA players of all time. We'll never know. Number 9 on my what-ifs list is what if Barry Sanders played longer. Now, I know I mentioned Barry Sanders in one of my videos a few weeks back, but a lot of people think Barry Sanders is the greatest running back of all time. I don't. I think he's top 5, but he was great. But not only was he was great on a team that was flat out pitiful. So you put up those kind of numbers for a team that's flat out pitiful, and it makes your numbers look even more impressive. Now, Barry Sanders retired at 29, and that's why for a lot of years, most people thought he was eventually going to come back. He just wanted to play for a winner, and Detroit wasn't going to let him go, and of course they're not, because he's the only decent player they have. If they didn't have Barry Sanders, nobody would watch Detroit Lions football. I mean, since he's retired, to this day, still nobody watches Detroit Lions football. So a lot of people thought that he was only retiring because he wanted to play for a winner, and Detroit wouldn't let him go. But years and years and years went by, and he never came back. So what would Barry Sanders' numbers have been if he would have played for a better team, or if he would have played 10 more years? We'll never know. Number 8 is what if Lou Gehrig hadn't got ALS, which ALS is what it's actually called, but most people call it Lou Gehrig's disease because of Lou Gehrig. But Lou Gehrig's career numbers, he had a .340 career batting average with 493 home runs and 1,995 RBIs. And this particular topic hits home to me because if people don't know, my mother actually died from Lou Gehrig's disease. It'll be 9 years ago coming up here in April. So I know all about Lou Gehrig's disease, but it's a disease that's not near as common as, the more big-time diseases, but it's rough. But Lou Gehrig actually, he pretty much for the most part, just knew himself something was wrong. He diagnosed himself that something was wrong. He just didn't know what, because back in those days, it was just something that you hardly ever heard of. And to this day, a lot of people still don't know what it is. But he was playing baseball, and all of a sudden, he just couldn't swing a bat anymore. He didn't know what was wrong. He just couldn't swing a bat. He knew if he's in his prime and he can't swing a baseball bat that weighs less than 2 pounds, there's something wrong. And he just said, hey, I've got fatigue. I'm tired. I don't know what's wrong. And then he stood up and did the big, huge press conference about how I'm the luckiest man alive, announced his retirement, and 2 days later, he died. So, according to most people, Lou Gehrig is considered one of the greatest baseball players of all time. But how good would he have been if he hadn't have got ALS? We'll never know. Number 7 is what if Jim Brown played longer? And just like Barry Sanders, a lot of people think Jim Brown is the best running back of all time. I personally am of the opinion that Jim Brown is the greatest running back of all time. Most people that watch sports nowadays, they won't even talk about people that played sports, back in the day, whether it's the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. All they think about is modern sports and modern athletes, and that's why every single time a great baseball player comes along, he's the greatest ever. Every single time a football player comes along, he's the greatest ever. It's like we're just totally, completely forgetting about history. Jim Brown is the best running back that's ever played the game of football. And just like Barry Sanders, he played 9 years. He had 126 touchdowns. He averaged 5.2 yards a carry in 9 seasons, and he had 12,312 total yards in 9 seasons. He would have a record that would not be touched as far as all-time rushing yards had he played longer, especially nowadays when running backs are almost obsolete now. They'll probably be out of the game altogether in 10 years. So you're talking about a record he would have that would never be broken if he would have played longer. Number 6 is, what if Curt Floyd hadn't opened the floodgates? And no pun intended, but his name was Curt Floyd, and he pretty much did open the floodgates. As far as free agency, he was a perennial top 5 outfielder for the Cardinals in the 50s and 60s, and he refused a trade all the way back in 1969 and actually took it all the way to the Supreme Court because he was not going to be traded, and that pretty much opened the floodgates in the world of free agency. So up until Curt Floyd, free agency was pretty much something that just didn't exist. And now it's trickled down so far, it's pretty much in college football now because the transfer portal is, for the most part, just free agents in the world of college football. Before we break into the top 5, let's recap 10 through 6. Number 10, Len Bias overdosing on cocaine. Number 9, Barry Sanders. What if he would have played longer? Number 8, Lou Gehrig getting ALS. Number 7, what if Jim Brown would have played longer? And number 6 was Curt Floyd opening the floodgates in free agency. Number 5 on my countdown of top 10 all-time biggest what-ifs in professional sports history, just like Lou Gehrig, was another athlete who got sick. Number 5 is, what if Mario Lemieux hadn't got Hodgkin's lymphoma? Now, I know a lot of people aren't hockey fans, but if you're just a casual sports follower and you just pretty much keep up with it on a regular basis without sitting back and watching all the games all the time, you know the name Mario Lemieux. The two names in hockey that everybody knows, even if you don't watch hockey, are Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux. And Mario Lemieux was diagnosed with Hodgkin's in 1993, and he actually played for a little bit after that with Hodgkin's, but he just always looked fatigued and tired, and always said he was tired. He was never the same. So if Mario Lemieux is already an all-time great, imagine how great he would have been if he had not have gotten Hodgkin's back in 1993. Number 4 is, what if Barry Bonds wasn't accused of steroids? And the reason I put it like that is because Barry Bonds is the greatest baseball player of all time. I know around June or July of last year, I did a top 10 countdown on baseball, and it was just top 10 all-time best hitters, and Barry Bonds was on that list, but he was not number 1, but that was just based on hitting. But if you put together Barry Bonds' running skills, his outfield skills, and his batting skills, he's the greatest baseball player of all time. A lot of people accuse him of taking steroids, and I hate it because there's no proof that it happened. There's no truth to the rumor that it happened. But a lot of people still want to believe that it happened, and I think the reason is he passed Hank Aaron, and now he's Major League Baseball's all-time home run leader. He has a record that will never be broke. He will forever be Major League Baseball's all-time home run leader. But the majority of people think Barry Bonds is arrogant, which it's false. It's another false rumor, but people still believe that. But you got to remember, back in the day, until the Marlins and the Rays came along, pretty much if you lived in the South, anywhere from Tennessee down to Florida, you were a Braves fan because there was no other team really in the South until the Marlins and Rays came along. So the Braves were the most popular baseball team in baseball for years because you had 10 or 12 states in the South that were Braves fans because there was nobody else in the South to pull for. So everybody that lived in the South was a Braves fan by default because back in the day with no cable or satellite, the local team was the Braves. So since the Braves were so popular for many, 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 many years, Hank Aaron was beloved for many, 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 many years. So when Barry Bonds broke Hank Aaron's record, it made almost all Braves fans turn against Barry Bonds. But you got to think that Barry Bonds played at a time where almost every single person in baseball was taking steroids. And every single person that was accused of taking steroids either admitted it or they took drug tests and the drug test proved they were on steroids. Well, Barry Bonds always said he didn't take them, and he was given these same drug tests that everybody else was given, and he passed them. So if Barry Bonds was on steroids at a time when everybody else was on steroids, and he was taking them, and he was passing those tests, he's the smartest man ever lived. Because you had thousands and thousands of players taking the same test, and they can't pass them, but one man can. So if he was, he's the smartest man that ever lived. But imagine how much credit Barry Bonds would be getting if people would stop accusing him of taking steroids without having the proof that he was actually on steroids. But even if you want to believe he was on steroids, if you look at Barry Bonds' numbers when he was in Pittsburgh, and most people didn't start accusing him of taking steroids until he got with the Giants. But even in Pittsburgh, when he was supposedly not on steroids, he still put up Hall of Fame numbers before he was even accused of being on steroids. So Barry Bonds is the greatest baseball player of all time. But if he would get the credit he deserved, he would be considered the greatest baseball player of all time. Number 3 on my list is, what if Michael Jordan stuck with baseball? Now, according to a lot of people, I'm not included, but according to a lot of people, Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time. I think he's top 5, but he's not the best. But even being top 5, most people, fair or not, when it comes to professional sports, they look at how many championships you won. You know, you look at Robert Horry. Robert Horry played basketball for over a decade in the NBA, and he played for a bunch of different teams, and it seems like every team he went to won an NBA title. So you've got a lot of people that want to put Robert Horry in the Hall of Fame because of how many rings he won. Robert Horry is nowhere close to being a Hall of Famer, but he won championships. Most people, they don't look at your stats. As long as you win championships, oh, you're great. So if Michael Jordan would have stuck with baseball and not came back to basketball, he would only have 3 NBA championships. So since he has 6, a lot of people think he's the best just because he has 6. Now, what if he stuck with baseball and he only won 3? Would he still be considered one of the best or the best according to who you talk to? I don't think he would. And I think had he stuck with baseball, he would have actually been a decent baseball player. Number 2 is, speaking of Michael Jordan, what if the Blazers had taken Michael Jordan instead of Sam Bowie? Now, a lot of people think Sam Bowie is the biggest flop in the history of the NBA draft because he was great in college and he was terrible in the NBA. But the Blazers thought he was going to be great, and they actually passed on Michael Jordan to get Sam Bowie. Now, what if the Blazers had taken Michael Jordan? Imagine what the history of basketball would look like back in that time. Would the Blazers have won the same amount of championships as the Bulls did if they would have drafted Michael Jordan? We'll never know. And the number 1 biggest what if in the history of professional sports, in my opinion, is what if Drew Bledsoe never gets injured? Because you got to remember, Tom Brady was never supposed to be what he ended up being. Now, of course, he's announced his retirement now, but he was never supposed to be what he ended up being. You know, he was a decent quarterback at Michigan. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't great. And the Patriots just took him and took a chance on him. They had zero expectations. They were just going to take a chance on him, let him sit behind Drew Bledsoe and learn what he could, and then see if he would stay to take over the starting quarterback job in the future when Drew Bledsoe finally retired. But when Drew Bledsoe got hurt, he was in the prime of his career. So now we'll always wonder, if Drew Bledsoe hadn't have got hurt, would Tom Brady have stayed in New England long enough to take over the starting quarterback job when Drew Bledsoe did finally retire? Or would he sit under Drew Bledsoe's tutelage and learn what he could and leave and go somewhere else to go ahead and become a starting quarterback instead of sitting behind Drew Bledsoe? And if that would have happened, would he still have won the same amount of championships at whatever team he went to that he did in New England? Because he only got the starting job because Drew Bledsoe got hurt. Now, of course, he comes in, takes the starting job, wins a Super Bowl, and the next thing you know, Drew Bledsoe's out of a job, and a couple of years later, Drew Bledsoe's out of the league. So poor Drew Bledsoe, he couldn't help it. He just got hurt. So the Patriots had to go with Tom Brady just out of necessity because Drew Bledsoe was hurt. But if Drew Bledsoe hadn't have got hurt, would Tom Brady have ended up being one of the greatest, if not the greatest quarterback of all time? Let's say Drew Bledsoe plays 5 more years. Is Tom Brady going to sit 5 more years behind Drew Bledsoe? Or is he just going to say, well, you know what? I'm not a top 5 draft pick. I'm not a top 10 draft pick. I've played 5 years in the NFL. I've been a backup. I'm just going to hang it up and do something else. Or does he leave New England and go somewhere else and take that job? We'll never know. So in my opinion, that's the biggest what if in the history of professional sports. But you could sit here all day long and do what ifs. You could do 10 in baseball, 10 in basketball, 10 in football, 10 in NASCAR, 10 in hockey, 10 in wrestling. So I figured I would just narrow it down to all major professional sports and do top 10 all-time what-ifs. And I still may, like I said, come back on here at a later time and do top 10 all-time collegiate what-ifs. But for this week, we're going to stick with professional what-ifs. And if you're a long-time sports follower, whether you're an older person or you're just a sports enthusiast, you could probably get out a piece of paper and off the top of your head write down 30 what-ifs just in the past 10 years. So this is a list that could go on and on and on and on, because almost every single day in every single sport, something happens that makes you scratch your head and say, what if? So that's why this is something that's fun to talk about. And I don't mean the crazy, stupid what ifs like, what if he'd have made that field goal? When missed field goals happen, drop touchdowns happen, bad calls happen, bad calls by the players and the coaches happen, missed tackles happen, missed blocks happen. So you can't go what ifs based on something like that, because it happens in every single game in every single sport. So I'm just talking about overall on the field and on the court what ifs. Hopefully you enjoyed this week's Top 10 Countdown. We know we do one each and every Wednesday here on the channel. Let's go ahead and get our dad joke of the day in here. Kim and Kanye West divorce has been rough on their oldest child, Northwest. It's like he's being pulled in 2 different directions. And that wraps it up for today's Ref Brandon and the Todd Family YouTube video. Until next time, it's Ref Brandon saying, just like in pro wrestling, life can be over by the count of 3. Tell your friends and family how much you love them. Bye.